Okay, we've taken a look at the muckrakers and their impact on what becomes known as the progressive era. Keep in mind that type of uh, digging, if you will, for the various problems that we have still exist today. Whether it's a TV program like 60 Minutes or some of the special reports you get on any of the networks, be it Fox, MSNBC, CNN, or local news. That's all owes it in part to the muckrakers of the progressive era. Today, of course, you can read or listen to podcasts, read someone's blog. That's all an example of muckraking, adapting to new technology. What we're going to take a look at now are the individuals that took those problems by the horns and attempted to deal with them. And more specifically, we're going to take a look at the three men who had focus cast upon them simply because they were presidents of the United States. We're going to take a look at Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson, their successes, their failures, and their conflicts.
On the national political landscape, the times seemed ripe for a progressive United States president, and one emerged, if only by a twist of fate. Six months after being elected president for the second time, William McKinley was assassinated, and his running mate, 42-year-old Vice President Theodore Roosevelt, succeeded him in 1901. He was the youngest person ever to hold that office. Roosevelt was born into a wealthy family, and although he suffered from asthma, he was determined to live an active life. From marksmanship to horseback riding and tennis, to boxing and hunting, to his heroic exploits with the Rough Riders during the Spanish-American War, Teddy Roosevelt proved a popular leader, first as governor of New York and then as president. When asked why people so adored him, he said he thought it was because,
"I put into words what is in their hearts and minds, but not their mouths."
Roosevelt outlined many progressive reforms to the American public and gave his plan a name, the Square Deal. When Roosevelt assumed office, over 80% of American business was owned by trusts. Although Congress had already enacted the Sherman Antitrust Act, it had not stopped the trusts from using unfair business practices to destroy their competition. Roosevelt began by suing the Northern Securities Railroad Trust. And in 1904, the Supreme Court agreed that the trust had become a monopoly and ordered it dissolved. Roosevelt's administration filed over 40 more suits. They pursued the beef industry, Standard Oil, the American Tobacco Company, and many other trusts. Americans overwhelmingly returned Roosevelt to the presidency in 1904. As he continued his work as a trust buster and a staunch proponent of governmental regulation of business. The many other progressives who were serving in local, state, and federal government helped Roosevelt to get the support he needed to get his proposed laws passed, like Mayor Samuel Golden Rule Jones of Toledo, Ohio, Governors Charles Aycock of North Carolina, Albert Cummins of Iowa, and Fighting Bob La Follette of Wisconsin, both of whom became United States senators. 2 years after his reelection, Roosevelt saw the Hepburn Act become law, which gave the Federal Interstate Commerce Commission the power to regulate the maximum fees railroads could charge. Roosevelt next turned his attention to questions surrounding public health. Like most Americans, he was horrified when he read Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, and even considered becoming a vegetarian. He appointed a commission to investigate Sinclair's claims.
A man could run his hand over these piles of meat and sweep off handfuls of the dried dung of rats. These rats were nuisances, and the packers would put poisoned bread out for them. They would die, and then rats, bread, and meat would go in the hoppers together.
Sinclair's charges of unsanitary conditions proved to be true. The commission confirmed his description of potted ham as a hash containing ground rope and pigskin. So in 1906, with Roosevelt's urging, Congress adopted the Meat Inspection Act. Federal inspectors would now guarantee safe, sanitary meat. That same year, more reforms followed, with the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act. Manufacturers now had to list the contents of foods and drugs on labels and could not make exaggerated claims about a medicine's benefits. No deleterious drug, chemical, or preservative could be used in medicines or foods. Roosevelt brought the same enthusiasm to protecting America's natural resources that he did to leveling the business playing field. After graduating from Harvard University, a young Theodore Roosevelt had worked as a cattle rancher in the Dakotas. He quickly realized that ranchers were allowing cattle to overgraze the Great Plains, that farmers had cut down forests and plowed under the prairies, and that America's natural resources were being squandered.
What will happen when our forests are gone, when the coal, the iron, the oil, and the gas are exhausted?
As president, Roosevelt withdrew 148 million acres of forest land from public sale, an area larger than Germany. On the advice of his friend, naturalist John Muir, Roosevelt established over 50 wildlife sanctuaries, 5 national parks, and designated 18 national monuments. He also put fellow conservationist Gifford Pinchot in charge of supervising the national forests.
The nation was obsessed by a fury of development. The American Colossus was fiercely intent on appropriating and exploiting the riches of the richest of all continents.
Roosevelt was so determined that Americans realized that the country's resources were not endless that he even banned Christmas trees in the White House. Theodore Roosevelt ignored tradition and redefined the image and scope of the President of the United States. He chose to be vibrant, visible, and accessible. Roosevelt was the people's choice throughout America, and in turn, America allowed him to use what he called his bully pulpit to accomplish his goals of reform and governmental regulation. However, a third term as president wasn't in keeping with tradition. So, bowing to President, Roosevelt instead handpicked his successor. William Howard Taft, who easily won the presidency in 1908. Taft shared Roosevelt.
Roosevelt is a fascinating individual. He is given credit for really giving birth to the modern presidency. It's Roosevelt who puts the presidency on the front page of the newspaper every day. He realized the impact and the importance and the power that came from being on the front page, and then chose to use the national media. And of course, the media fell in love with him. Here was a vibrant individual who, if you will, humanized the White House. He brings his family. I believe he had 5 or 6 children. They ran around the White House. They rode their ponies up the steps inside the White House and rode it on the second floor. They oftentimes would break into cabinet meetings and deposit a frog or a snake on their father's lap so he could take a look at it. This was very different. This was a man, again, of youth, of vigor, and who used that in order to mold national public opinion to follow through on the reforms that he wished to initiate. Those reforms would be lumped under one title, and that, of course, was the Square Deal.
The principles for which we stand are the principles of fair play and a square deal for every man and every woman in the United States.
One of the things that always bothered him was the idea that the class that he was from, the rich, wealthy upper class, oftentimes rejected him because they felt that he had declared war on them. That, of course, was not necessarily the case, but nonetheless, that was a label that he would carry with him for a long, long time. Roosevelt was a child who had asthma. wasn't able to participate in a lot of the activities that younger children did. And his father took him aside and said to him, Theodore, you have the mind, but you do not have the body. And the mind without the body is essentially useless. So his father did what I'm sure any of our parents would do. He built him his own gym on the second floor of their Manhattan townhouse. And Roosevelt worked incredibly hard in order to solve the problem of asthma. Of course, going out to Arizona at times didn't help or didn't hurt either. Roosevelt would go eventually to Harvard at age 16. By 17 or 18, he had already published a book about American naval strength and read Alfred Thayer Mahan's book on the importance of having a powerful naval fleet. We'll talk more about that later. So he's a guy who was active. He helped manage the baseball team, the football team. Ironically, as president, he would outlaw football as too violent. And until there were certain reforms made in the sport, he would not allow it to be played. Now,
the man is the leader of the free world. He's brilliant. He's funny. He's an above-average dancer.
That he was. If you take a look in his short lifetime at all the activities that he involved in, you can understand why the ambassador from France said all the world was being spun and Theodore was the spinner. Now, what he referred to was this. When he came to, he being the newly appointed French ambassador to the United States, when he came to present his credentials at the White House to Roosevelt, Roosevelt was dressed in a sweatsuit. And Roosevelt said, would you like to come with me? The ambassador, fully dressed in a tuxedo, said, why, of course, Mr. President. How do you like my French accent? Anyway, they proceeded to go on a jog for 5 miles. Roosevelt in his sweatsuit and the French ambassador wearing his tux. When they finished, Roosevelt walked him over to the White House tennis courts and challenged him to a game. Now, of course, the French ambassador could not say no, so they played tennis. After that, Roosevelt said, let's play catch with a 10-pound medicine ball. They did that. Then Roosevelt said, do you have the stamina to get in the ring and go a few rounds? Referring to a boxing ring that was there on the White House grounds. The French ambassador looked at him and said, Monsieur President, no offense, but I would rather die. And then proceeded to collapse right there on the ground. That was Teddy Roosevelt. He was the youngest state senator. Now, not a United States senator. He was a New York state senator, but the youngest in that state's history. As I pointed out, he was already an author. He would become at a very young age the police commissioner of New York, during which time he would disguise himself as a homeless person and roam the streets of New York at night to see exactly what his police were doing. He will become the Assistant Secretary of the Navy and use that position to prepare the United States for entry into what will become known as the Spanish-American War. He will become the governor of New York. Prior to that, he becomes a ranch owner. His wife, his mother, and an unborn child would all die within an hour of one another. He is thoroughly depressed by it. He leaves his children with his sister, and he goes west. There he will buy a ranch and be nicknamed Four Eyes because of his glasses by the cowboys out there. But he will use them and his stamina to fight rustlers, come up with laws, and of course, completely change himself. He will be appointed as the first commissioner of the new Civil Service Bureau, a result of the Pendleton Act. And He is going to use that to try to put an end to corruption and all the things that went with giving out jobs to your friends and political supporters. He will resign as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He become colonel of a military outfit nicknamed the Rough Riders, who would participate and ride to glory, if you will, in Cuba up San Juan Hill during the Spanish-American War. All of this before he reached the age of 42. Now, when he becomes president after McKinley's assassination, McKinley would be assassinated by a gentleman, a foreigner by the name of Charles Guiteau. Guiteau was an anarchist who believed that America, or the world, if you will, was better off without government, without rules, without laws, that there would be a natural order to things. And that's what led to the assassination of McKinley. The shame of it was, in a sense, that if McKinley had lived during this era, he would have been easily saved. But medicine being what it was back then, he hung on for a few weeks and then passed away, bringing to fruition a prophecy made by Mark Hanna, who had been McKinley's campaign manager. When members of the Republican Party decided to get rid of Roosevelt. And what I mean by get rid of Roosevelt, he had become a rather activist, reforming governor in New York. So they wanted to get him out of there. He was fighting against Boss Tweed and, of course, Tammany Hall, the ring that controlled New York. So they said, what better place to get rid of him than to kick him literally upstairs? Give him the job, the meaningless job of vice president. Hanna understood their logic, but he said, do you realize that there would only be one heartbeat between that madman and the presidency? And of course, that's exactly what happened. When he gets into office, he will make the statement that he intends to carry out McKinley's policies. And as was later pointed out by many journalists, that's exactly what he did. He carried them outside and buried them. He was a progressive reformer who believed that it was the president who should set the legislative agenda. What does that mean? It is the president that should propose laws, not just enforce them. And it's really been that way pretty much ever since. The majority of laws that Congress deals with come from ideas put forth by the executive branch. And Roosevelt saw no problem in fighting oftentimes the hands that fed him. Again, he would refer to his program as the square deal. What exactly did he mean by that? Well, this particular incident, early in his first administration after taking over for McKinley, kind of highlighted that. Coal miners went on strike, I should say, from work. 10% raise is what they required. The mine owners wanted to do away with the unions altogether. So it became at times a rather violent struggle. Roosevelt begged them to come to the table and reach an agreement. The mine owners refused. At that point in time, Roosevelt took a look at what was about to happen. It was in late fall, and most people heated their homes back then with coal. So wintertime was approaching. And he realized that the American people were going to be the ones that suffered. So therefore, for the first time in American history, he threatened to send in the armies to take over the coal mines. He would run the coal mines. The government would reap the profits, and the coal would be shipped on its way to the American people so that they could heat their homes. And as he said, the American people deserve a square deal. Eventually, an agreement was reached on terms proposed by the president. And as he said, the door to the White House swings open as easily for the mine owners as it does for the workers, as easily as it does for all laborers, as it does for all business owners. And that was his square deal. He will eventually get the nickname of Trust Buster. And as you heard in the film, he will attack the Northern Securities, a railroad organization owned by J.P. Morgan. And he and Morgan, for the most part, and there's going to be a notable exception in 1907, for the most part, they become bitter enemies. Now, does he dislike trusts? Well, as you already know from the quiz, no, he does not. He feels that trusts should be regulated by a strong executive branch. The bad trusts should be eliminated, but as long as they follow the rules established by laws such as the Hepburn Act, then there should be no problem. U.S. Steel is a perfect example. And keep in mind, U.S. Steel, a good trust owned by this time, J.P. Morgan. So the coal miner strike, again, is a illustration of his work and the square deal. His first message to Congress would really lay out exactly what he thought. There is a widespread conviction in the minds of the American people that the great corporations known as trusts are in certain of their features and tendencies hurtful to the general welfare. He will go on to state that in some instances that is true, but in others they are of great benefit. So his government was going to promote the general welfare, which is exactly, of course, what the preamble to the Constitution said. He becomes a staunch conservationist. And there's many people that feel that his creation of the national parks, such as the Grand Canyon and Yosemite National Park in California, among others, is perhaps his greatest legacy to the American people. He begins an organization, or a bureaucracy, I guess, in his administration, known as the Bureau of Corporations. This was to look into, as a precursor to the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, the business practices of many of these trusts. And they are going to use the Sherman Antitrust Act as it was meant to be used. When I say meant to be used, it had been used before, but it was used to break up unions, not the big corporations that it was designed to govern.
Thank you.
Not at all. Theodore Roosevelt, 26th President of these United States of America, at your service.
At your service. His idea was that the president, and this kind of steals something from Andrew Jackson, is the only man elected by all the people. And therefore, it is his job to represent them and make sure, as you see there, that every man gets.
The principles for which we stand are the principles of fair play and a square deal for every man and every woman in the United States. A square deal politically, a square deal in matters social and industrial. I wish to see you boys join the Progressive Party and act in that party and as good citizens in the same way I'd expect any one of you to act in a football game. In other words, don't flinch, don't foul, and hit the line hard.
So, what exactly did he call for in a square deal? Well, control the trusts, not eliminate them, but control them. Promote public health and safety. And this, of course, was going to be brought home to him, particularly by Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle. improving working conditions. Plants such as these, which were a health hazard not only to the people that worked in them, but the people who lived in the general area. Under him will come the Hepburn Act, which of course gave teeth to the ICC in being able to control the railroads. And of course, he is going to get the support of the Supreme Court and Congress. And as you see, he will file 44 suits, earning him the nickname of Trust Buster. Now, again, it's he who gives the nickname Muckraker to the journalists, such as in Upton Sinclair, which reveal the conditions that exist in various industries or problems, living conditions, etc. And it was not meant as a compliment. But after reading Sinclair's book and after sitting down with Jane Addams and others, he becomes an acolyte to them, if you will, and realizes that these are some of the problems that he is going to have to deal with. And he's going to push for the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act. Near the end of his administration, he's going to get involved in foreign policy. Now, he had always been involved in foreign policy. As you're going to see when we take a look at imperialism, it is he who pushes perhaps one of the greatest engineering feats of all time, and that is the construction of the Panama Canal. And for a long time, that is going to be the cornerstone of our foreign policy in the Western Hemisphere. In 1906, he is going to attempt to mediate in a war between the Russians and the Japanese, the Russo-Japanese War. And he brings them to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and gets them to negotiate a settlement to end this war. Now, was there any particular reason? Well, of course, because it was hurting American trade in the Far East. Remember, in foreign policy, you never, ever do something for nothing. But that's something that he did, not only ended the war, but it got him the Nobel Peace Prize, a prize which Trump thinks that he should win for negotiating God knows what. When he finally leaves office, he announces that he's going to go on a safari to Africa to collect specimens to send back to the Smithsonian Institute. The Smithsonian Institute was his baby. And he's going to not only go throughout Africa, but later on tour the great capitals of Europe and be hailed as a true American. Now, when he announces that he's going to go, J.P. Morgan holds a banquet, and he has all 100 people in the room stand up and drink health to the lions. Now, just to back up, in 1907, 1 year before the end of Roosevelt's last term in office, there is a severe economic downturn, and the government is going bankrupt. Roosevelt almost begs Morgan for help, and Morgan lends gold to the United States government, bailing them out. So the two of them at times did work hand in hand. Morgan never let Roosevelt, of course, forget that. Now, I said Roosevelt's second term. Roosevelt could have run for another term, and there is no doubt that he would have been reelected. But he had made a promise when he ran on his own after serving 2 years of McKinley's term. And that promise was that he would not run for another term. So he could not back out of it. So consequently, he handpicked his successor, knowing that the American people would elevate anybody that he pointed to, and that would be William Howard Taft, former governor of the Philippines, islands, of course, in the Pacific that we had taken over as a result of the Spanish-American War, a man who did not want the job. What he wanted to do was be appointed to the Supreme Court, but his wife pushed him, and before you know it, Taft would become president. Later on, as he was turning 50, Roosevelt is going to, just to show his youthful vitality and enthusiasm, he's going to go on an expedition in Brazil on the River of No Return, which turns out to be a disaster. A couple of men are going to die on the expedition. One man is going to go mad and run into the jungle, never to be seen again. Roosevelt himself will come down with a deadly case of malaria, something that he's never really going to be able to kick. But as he said, it was my last chance to be a boy. So, the new president of the United States is William Howard Taft. His campaign slogan, "Get on the raft with Taft." Catchy, huh? Taft was a progressive, just like Teddy Roosevelt. And he is going to initiate almost 90 legal operations against various trusts, using the Sherman Antitrust Act and other laws that were now in place. And yet it is Roosevelt that is called the trust buster. As you see under him, the Mann-Elkins Act, now overseeing the new industries of the telephone and telegraph company. He establishes a children's bureau to look into the working conditions that the nation's children were laboring under. However, he is also a bit more conservative than Roosevelt and will eventually fire Gifford Pinchot, who Roosevelt had appointed as the head of the Forestry Service. And that's not going to sit well with Roosevelt. And those two best friends, they exchanged over 400 and some letters, are going to become bitter political enemies. This all leads us to the election of 1912. Extremely important for a number of reasons. You have four major candidates. Taft will be the Republican nominee to finish out or to embark upon a second term. Roosevelt, who has returned from his sojourns through Africa and Europe, now wants the Republican nomination, but it is denied him. So Roosevelt joins the Progressive Party, which will later be called the Bull Moose Party, and we'll talk about that in a minute, why it changed its name. The Democrats will nominate the governor of New Jersey, former president of Princeton University, and that, of course, will be Woodrow Wilson, who, for all intents and purposes, though he is from New Jersey, was a Southerner, born and raised in Virginia. And Eugene Debs, former convict and future convict, and a socialist who believed that the ends of private enterprise and putting it in the hands of the government or ownership in the hands of the people would be necessary. All four of them have one thing in common. In effect, they are all, depending on how you define the label, progressives. So, Taft.
Theodore Roosevelt, at your service.
Teddy Roosevelt.
Let's take a walk on the wild side.
Woodrow Wilson.
I tell you, I don't get no respect. No respect at all.
Eugene V. Debs. Roosevelt is campaigning in Chicago. And as his caravan is going down Michigan Avenue towards Soldiers Field, where he's going to give a speech before tens of thousands, an assassin jumps out of the crowd and shoots him in the lung. Fortunately, though the bullet lodges in his lung, its force is dissipated because it hits the folded manuscript of his speech and his glasses case. So, what does he do? He takes a Turkish towel, which is a huge bath towel, goes to Soldiers Field, holds the towel, which eventually becomes soaked with blood, and proceeds to speak for an hour and a half. Remember, there are no microphones, no megaphones back then. And that is all him with a bullet lodged in his lung. When asked later on how he avoided death, Roosevelt said, "I feel as strong as a bull moose." And so that nickname would be attached to the political party. Both Roosevelt and Wilson run on similar platforms. Roosevelt, of course, the new nationalism, and Wilson, of course, the new freedom. This is a commercial for Teddy Roosevelt back then.
I traveled all around the world, I sailed on every sea, met every king and potentate, including old John D. In every corner of the earth, they know King Edward's fame, but there's a ruler greater still, no doubt you've heard his name. It's Theodore, the peaceful Theodore, of all the rulers great or small, he is the greatest of them all. He's first in peace, he's first of all in war, he's Indian and in Yankee land. Hip, hip, hooray, hip, hip, hooray, hooray for Theodore.
Now, it goes longer than that, but compare that with some of the ads that you see today. So he takes over the Progressive Party right from the hands of Fighting Bob La Follette, a United States Senator from Wisconsin. Roosevelt didn't intend to do that, but that is exactly what happened. Now that he's back on the job, he wants Teddy, or his old friend Taft, to give it up. What happens as a result? Well, take a look at the electoral map. Wilson sweeps the number of states because of the split in the Republican Party. If it had been between Roosevelt and Wilson, Roosevelt would have won easily. But that split enabled Wilson to win most of the states. Notice that Taft only takes 2 states, Utah and Vermont.
In 1910, America was a nation of 90 million, and for most of us, this is what we meant by horsepower. Life in this time was simpler. There was no television or radio, and coal cost less than $5 a ton. 1 out of 4 Americans owned a horse, but if you owned a car, you were 1 in 200. William Howard Taft was in the White House. Under President Roosevelt, Taft had served as first governor of the Philippines and as Secretary of War, and he had Roosevelt's strong endorsement when he won the presidency in 1908. But Taft was not the vigorous and crusading politician Roosevelt was, and by 1912, Taft's conservative policies had so angered the former president that Roosevelt decided to challenge Taft for the presidential nomination. Republican Party regulars gave Taft the nomination, but that didn't stop Roosevelt. Endorsed by the Progressive Party, Teddy campaigned for a return to the White House, saying he felt strong as a bull moose. The Democratic nominee was Woodrow Wilson, former president of Princeton University and governor of New Jersey. Though Taft and Roosevelt had once been friends, the 1912 campaign was bitter. Roosevelt attacked Taft's conservatism and called for a new nationalism with sweeping progressive reforms, workmen's compensation, minimum wage, and child labor laws. With Republican loyalties divided, Wilson won the election of 1912. Roosevelt carried only 6 states, Taft only 2. Wilson, like Roosevelt, was a progressive politician. He had campaigned for a new freedom, and once in office, he called Congress into special session. New laws brought sweeping changes: banking and currency reform, a federal trade commission, the income tax, and even stronger antitrust laws, all enacted to protect the public interest. The political reforms of Woodrow Wilson's years were among the most significant in history, but there were demands for change by more radical elements, and these would take more time. Poor working conditions and low pay led to many strikes and demonstrations, and sometimes determined protests in the name of social justice did succeed, like the movement for child labor laws. Long hours, dangerous conditions. Who would protect the children in the factories and on the farms from conditions that made them sick and old by their teens?
Now, Wilson, though he comes from New Jersey, was really Southern in his roots. As a matter of fact, when he went to Princeton as a student at age 18, that was the first time he had ever heard the Star-Spangled Banner. That's how Southern his roots were. And he brought with it a Southern bigotry. He was a racist, there is no doubt. Matter of fact, if you look at today's Philadelphia Inquirer, there's a story about the University of Princeton doing away with the Woodrow Wilson College and renaming it for an African-American female who married, of course, George Lucas and has become quite a philanthropist. But Wilson would reinstitute segregation within the government, something that had been done away with, and he is going to bring it back. Now, he is an idealist and extremely religious, and that can be, in the wrong hands, a dangerous combination. He looks for perfection, and thanks to his father and another influence, he grows up during the Civil War. He strongly disapproves of war. And he believes, as his father had told him, that God favors him. So he believes in predestination, and he believes in his own predestination for greatness. God has reached out and touched him and handed him God's plan. Roosevelt refused to compromise. And in many instances, that is extremely dangerous in the world of politics, because true politicians understand the art of compromise. Many of the politicians, of course, we have in Congress today don't understand that at all. Now, when he talked about his new freedom, he talked about fighting against a triple wall of privilege, high tariffs, corrupt banking systems, and the evils of the trusts who discouraged any type of competition. So he was going to attack that triple wall of privilege. Tariffs would finally be lowered for the first time since the Civil War with the Underwood tariff. The banks would be corralled under a system which is still extremely important in our economy today, that of the Federal Reserve System, affectionately called the Fed. And of course, the trust had numerous laws passed to control them, one of them being the Clayton Antitrust Act. So the triple wall of privilege, we were trapped inside that triple wall, and he wanted to break down these walls with, again, his new freedom. He believed, as you see at the bottom, in Jefferson's idyllic version of America, where everybody would have, two cats in the yard, their small farm, etc. That, of course, was not to be. But nonetheless, he's going to initiate some extremely important reforms that are going to change life in America. So his new freedom, Underwood Tariff, Federal Reserve Act, Clayton Antitrust Act, and the beginnings of the Federal Trade Commission, which would look into business practices. Now, as you see, he's not getting rid of trusts, but what he's doing is he's putting different bureaus and different laws in effect to regulate them. Wilson was different from Roosevelt in the sense that Wilson did not make this personal, whereas Roosevelt wanted everything channeled or funneled into the executive branch of the government. Please pardon the interruption here, and let's hope that this works. He is going to become the most influential individual to inhabit the White House up until this time. And that is because he is going to concentrate on peace. Peace? Well, what are we talking about? By the time that he's ready to enter his second term, World War I, of course, it wasn't called that at that time, it was called the Great War, was already in progress in 1914, 2 years into his presidency. So his new freedom philosophy was going to be put slightly on hold. I want you to take a look at the bottom there. Attorney General McReynolds. He's going to be appointed Attorney General, and the man is, as you see there, a blatant bigot. He would not hire Jews, blacks, women, smokers, married people, drinkers, etc. And eventually, Wilson appoints him as a justice on the Supreme Court. So that's the underlying philosophy in certain respects to the Wilson administration. Now, again, this is simply an explanation of the various laws that we've talked about. You see the passage of the 17th and 19th Amendment. 17th Amendment is going to give us the direct election of senators. Finally, something that had been a populist reform, adopted also by the progressives, and now is going to come to fruition. The 19th Amendment, which is passed near the end of his second administration, gives women the right to vote. Now, the suffragists had approached him about doing this. He kind of put them off, but then when we enter World War I, he realizes he needs the support of women. So he makes a promise that was somewhat hollow at the time, but they would not let it go. And Wilson finally delivers with the 19th Amendment. However, with the FTC, oftentimes he does not follow their recommendations. He sometimes does not vigorously pursue the Clayton Antitrust Act, the racial attitudes that we talked about. And he ran into a problem. Many progressives believed that for democracy to work, government had to be more efficient. However, if you take a look at the concept of liberty, can liberty and an efficient democracy exist hand in hand? Take a look, for example, just yesterday in New York City, you had Orthodox Jews and Catholics come together and burn their face masks because it was inhibiting their liberties. You saw where some right-wing militias were going to kidnap the governor of Michigan because they felt that she was a traitor and was violating their liberties. So what is liberty, and how does it get along with an efficient democracy? When he runs for re-election in 1916, his re-election slogan is, "He kept us out of war." By 1916, of course, the war was already 2 years old and had bogged down in the muck of the trenches on the Western Front and in Russia. Millions had already died, and we just wanted to stay away from it. We were isolationists primarily in our view. And Wilson runs on that platform, even though he thought eventually at some point in time we might have to get involved. So in the election of 1916, as you see, once again, Wilson wins fairly easily. However, it's only really a 4% difference in the Electoral College and only a 3% difference in the total overall vote. So he may have captured a lot of states, but in terms of population, that was not necessarily the case. And it was California that came through at the last minute, which really put him over the top. Because he was so afraid of Teddy Roosevelt and afraid that Roosevelt would run in 1916, he is going to adopt part of the platform of Roosevelt's new nationalism. He is going to put child labor laws into effect. And that is due again to the specter of Teddy Roosevelt hanging over him. At the same time, Roosevelt is imploring Wilson to get involved in the war, that we cannot sit huddled within our borders. And then on the other hand, he's got the rise of socialism. Now, do not confuse socialism and communism. They are not the same thing. Socialism is economic reform. Communism, though originally meant to be that, was more of a governmental thing. And of course, Debs would be locked up under Wilson eventually when we joined the war for his criticisms and his imploring America's youth not to register for the draft. That would put him in prison, where he would run again for the presidency in 1920, and behind bars, he still gets over 1 million votes. So, what have we gotten from the progressives? That our system can adopt to changes, that this movement is not just on a national level, but also on the local mayors, governors, state senators, commissions in cities. All of these things were designed to deal with many of the things that the progressives were looking at.
Despite his admirable record of accomplishments and his support of suffrage for women, Wilson, like Roosevelt and Taft, did little to improve African Americans' civil rights. Perhaps it was his Southern upbringing that influenced his decision to appoint segregationists as the heads of federal agencies. Segregation expanded in the military, and the practice returned to the Capitol and federal offices in Washington, D.C. that had been desegregated during Reconstruction.
I have made no promises in particular to Negroes, except to do them justice.
Ida Wells Barnett had joined W.E.B. Du Bois, Mary Church Terrell, Jane Addams, and others in founding the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. In 1910, the NAACP had supported Wilson's bid for the presidency. Now the African Americans and their white supporters felt Wilson had betrayed their trust. As editor of the Memphis Free Speech, Ida Wells Barnett had led a campaign to protest the lynching of African Americans in the United States. Despite the fact that between 1892 and 1903, some 3,000 African Americans were killed, Wilson failed to support federal anti-lynching legislation or reverse the practice of segregation in his government. William Monroe Trotter, editor of the Boston-based newspaper The Guardian, asked him,
"Have you a new freedom for white Americans and a new slavery for your Afro-American fellow citizens? God forbid."
There were limits to the success and scope of progressivism as evidenced by Wilson's inaction on civil rights. Still, the progressive era did reflect the basic optimism of the American public, a belief that any problem could be solved. Despite Wilson's rhetoric, class struggles were emerging, unemployment was growing in America, and by 1914, the First World War had broken out in Europe. Woodrow Wilson was re-elected in 1916, and although his campaign slogan was, "He kept us out of war," America inevitably became involved. The attention of the nation now turned from the reforms and inequalities of the progressive era to the reality and horror of war.
So, the shortcomings of progressivism, again, keeping in mind that it was not a national movement. There was one time a national party, of course, to try to get Roosevelt elected, but that was it. It was a series of stop and starts by different groups in different areas, none of it coordinated by any single leader or any single desire. And as you see there, did little for African Americans and for Native Americans. W.E. Du Bois eventually, and I think I had mentioned this before, becomes disgusted with the lack of progress and leaves the United States and will move to Africa, which is where he will die as a communist. One of the last reforms of the progressives would be the introduction of prohibition. And eventually that's going to be repealed in 1933, I believe, by the 20th Amendment.
The progressive movement gained momentum and followers as Americans read the work of writers and journalists who exposed corruption in government and business and described the deplorable life of many working-class Americans. These writers became popularly known as muckrakers, from a character in John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress who raked up the mud and muck of the world. Author up to...
And did they leave us with a better America? Well, that is something for all of us to decide.